I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Close your eyes and remember a really special, delicious meal. Take a moment and think about all the food at the table, who was there in the room with you, where you were, why you were gathering. And remember how it felt to be at that delicious, special, meaningful meal. I want you to hold on to that feeling as we work through our scripture today. If your meal was anything like the one that I was thinking of, you left the table feeling like you needed to be rolled to your car. Like you just ate so much, you were filled up to the brim, so full that you didn't think you might ever need to eat again. That was the last meal you ever needed. Then you go home, you go to bed, and you wake up the next morning, and what happens? You're hungry again. Miracle of miracles, somehow, after eating all of that food and feeling so very full, you are hungry again. The crowd that we hear in the gospel this morning is hungry again. They had this awesome meal with Jesus just the day before, out on this field with all of these people. They didn't even know they were going to get fed, but in the end, they had so much food. They'd all eaten their fill so very much that they had 12 baskets of bread and fish left over. This was a feast. And yet the very next day, they are still hungry. This gospel lesson is important to put in context because it comes exactly on the heels of the last one. It's hard to quite understand why the crowd is chasing after Jesus and asking for signs and pushing him unless you realize that this comes exactly after the feeding of the 5,000. That is incredibly important to understand how these people felt on this morning when they're chasing after Jesus. They are chasing after him. They are still riding the high of the day before, and they're hungry. But it's a different kind of hunger. They're chasing after him and trying to figure out what it was about that meal that leaves them with this kind of ache this next day. It wasn't just bread and fish that they got in the field. This meal was special because it gave them a glimpse, a taste, a morsel of the kingdom. And they are hungry for more, but they're hungry in a whole new way. So they go to Jesus and they ask for more. But Jesus says, you're not asking for the right things. This is about going deeper than what feeds you on the surface level. This isn't just about feeding your flesh. You've got to pay attention and realize that what you're looking for is something that will feed your soul, something that will give you life. So they ask, well, how do we get this special kind of food? What's so special about this, and how do we get it again? What must we do in order to accomplish what God requires so we can feel like this again? And Jesus has the simplest answer. Believe. But it's so hard. What does that mean to believe? To believe in the one whom God sent. Have you ever felt hangry? It's this combination of being so very, very hungry, your blood sugar is just bottomed out, that you are angry about it. And you are lashing out in all kinds of ways that don't make sense. You are so hungry that you're snapping at your family. You have no patience whatsoever with anyone. I am absolutely speaking from personal experience. This is something that I have to work on. I always work on. But I wonder if the crowd is feeling this way too. It's this weird kind of hunger that they can't explain, that they're so desperate to fill, that makes them kind of desperate. It makes them act out in ways that don't really make sense. Because on this morning, the day after the feeding of the 5,000, the very people that were fed in the field asked for a sign. I crack up every time I hear the reading. They asked for a sign when they just lived a sign. They just lived a miracle. So it speaks to the depth of their hunger. It speaks to the depth of their need for something more that they can't even express. That they come to Jesus, and when Jesus says believe, they say, well, why don't you just prove it to us? Prove to us that you are the one that we are supposed to believe in, whatever believe is supposed to mean. And so they talk about Moses. The one thing that comes into their mind is that Moses in the desert fed them. Moses in the wilderness fed them with manna. So it's like that, Jesus, right? It's like that. And Jesus says, yes, and. You keep looking at the surface of this, of thinking about just feeding your flesh, but what I need you to do is look deeper. Look underneath what's happening on the surface. It's not just about feeding your flesh. It wasn't just about Moses providing for you in the wilderness. This is about God hearing you and hearing your need and responding. This is so much deeper than manna in the desert. This is about feeding your soul and giving you life everlasting. I think Jesus could have performed miracle after miracle in their midst, feeding them with bread and fish again and again, and they probably still would have asked for a sign. Jesus fights this battle his entire ministry. Prove to us who you are. Prove it, and then we'll believe. Believe is what God is asking us to do. Believe is what Jesus says God requires of us. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe because our culture tells us that believing is kind of like believing in Santa or believing in the Easter Bunny. But you can't put your trust in the Easter Bunny. You can't put your trust in Santa. This kind of belief requires so much more of us than surface level. It requires us to give up a part of ourselves. It requires us to put our trust outside of who we are into something so much greater than us. Trust that God will provide what we need. Trust that God hears our cries in the wilderness. Trust that God will respond when we need comfort and assurance and sustenance. But how do we do this? How do we get from that surface level to deep down in our souls to really trust, to truly believe? So many things in our world and in our lives fail us. So many things break our trust. That family member who doesn't pay us back when they say they will, or a friend that doesn't show up. Technology that fails us every single time that the rector goes out of town, so that you have to run around crazy on Sunday morning trying to get the stream to work or the sound to work okay. Things in our world fail us. Our trust is broken all the time. So it makes sense that the crowd would be wary of this requirement to believe and thus fully trust. Give us a sign. Then we'll feel safe enough to trust you. Prove it to us. And so Jesus takes the very example that they give him, and he says, when you were lost in the wilderness, God fed you. God gave you manna to eat. God led you through the desert to the promised land. This connection to this important shared story of history as people of God invites us all to reflect on the ways that God has heard us, has responded to us, has led us when we needed God most. Jesus invites us to remember all of the ways that God has been trustworthy. Maybe it was a time when a loved one died and you couldn't get yourself out of bed in the morning, and God sent sunshine and friends and family to care and mourn with you. Maybe it was when you made a really big mistake and you didn't know if your friend was going to forgive you, but God helped reconciliation happen and your relationship was rebuilt. Maybe it was when you were so hungry that you followed a traveling preacher to a big open field and somehow loaves of bread and fish were enough for 5,000. Again and again, God proves to us that God is trustworthy. Again and again, God shows us that though the things of our world may fail us, that God is steadfast. Again and again, we have the opportunity to see and thus believe that when we put our trust in God, we are rewarded with tastes of the kingdom. This is a nice thing to preach about, right? How do we put this into our daily lives, into our daily practice? How do I live my life in a way that helps me remember that God is trustworthy? One way that you can try this is utilizing the practice of the Ignatian Examen. This is a daily method of reflecting on your day so that you can see where and how God showed up for you, where and how you leaned on God. The first step is recalling the presence of Christ, taking a moment to be quiet and still and feeling the presence of Christ in your midst. And then you give thanks. Begin with gratitude, giving thanks for everything that God is doing in your life, even if you know nothing about it. And then reflect on the times in your day when you felt the presence of God. Even if you didn't feel it in the moment, maybe looking back, you can see God was there then. God was there at the table with us. God was with me in that hard conversation, and I'm so very grateful. But then you look back and you see the times when maybe you felt distant from God, times when you needed to call upon the presence of Christ so that you could feel it made manifest in your life. And then you begin to look ahead. You look ahead to the next day, thinking of all the things on your to-do list, and you ask God to be present in all of those moments. And then you conclude in prayer. Maybe it's praying something familiar like the Lord's Prayer, or maybe God gives you the words for a prayer that day. But this daily practice of looking back and looking forward helps to train our eyes and our hearts to see how and where God was present, how and where God showed up for us. When God fed us, when God guided us, when God gave us the words, when everything else failed in our heads. This is a way of developing a practice of reflection so that when you get to a time in your life when you're desperate for anything to trust in, you'll be able to look back and say, I remember when God was there. I remember that when I needed God most, God showed up again and again and again, and you'll have concrete things to remember. This is when God was trustworthy. When everything else in my life failed me, this is when God did not fail. Because God doesn't fail. God is always there. We just have to believe so that we can see.